Welcome to the Old Bald Guy's Shop. I'm Ken Houston, and obviously, from the glare, I'm the old bald guy. I'm a hobbyist. This is not a commercial shop. I just do woodworking for fun. I do things for friends, family, and folks in the church, and I don't charge labor. I just do it because I like woodworking. And today I'm going to show you how to make a memory box. It's just a little 4x4 box. The lid lifts off, but you can make them as decorative as you want. This one is paddock with walnut trim and a figured maple top. This one is walnut with paddock trim, an inlay and a figured maple top, and this one is sapele with a paddock top and trim and a yellow maple inlay, and this one is lacewood with ebony trim and a inlay. So they're trimmed both on the bottom and on the top. Takes me about 6 hours to make one of these. If I'm making several, if I'm just making one, it probably takes longer because of the equipment setup. So I started making these a couple of years ago when one of my brothers passed away, and his wife wanted to share the ashes with the family, and she wanted some small boxes for that, and so I made some. And then I thought, what about the family members who didn't want ashes? So I made them as memory boxes. And since then, we've had more family members pass away. I've made more. I think I'm up to about 25 of these that I've made now, just for family and friends. So I'm going to show you how to make these. And so I welcome your feedback. You can email me at theoldbaldguysshop@gmail.com, just like it sounds. So the first order of business is to dimension some lumber, and we have 4 different woods that we're going to use for these boxes, for the bodies of the boxes. Sapele, walnut, lacewood, and paddock. So I'll set up my stop for my chop saw, just to make it easier on myself. So I've cut those boards to 25 inches, and now I'm going to joiner. I've selected the edge that I want to have the good edge, and I'm going to joiner these just so I have one straight edge to start with. I've set my saw to 4 1/16 inches. I want my finished box to be 4 inches by 4 inches square. But I cut my wood just a 1/16 of an inch wide. In case there's any chip out, I can trim that off. I also have a piece of figured maple that I'm going to use for the top on at least one of these boxes. So I'm going to cut that to 4 1/16 as well. So I've set my saw to 2 1/8 high, set my fence at 9/16, and I'm going to split these pieces so that I have a 9/16 piece and a little bit of scrap left over that I can use for making tops. So before we go any farther, I have a piece of figured maple that I'm going to use for the top on one of these boxes, but I like my tops to have the same wood on the inside as the rest of the body of the box. So I have a little thin piece of walnut that we cut off of one of those pieces when we ripped it. And I'm going to glue that onto this piece. But before I do that, I'm going to plane this so that the combined thickness of this piece and the walnut equals a 1/2 inch, because all of our construction is a 1/2 inch. So now we have our combined thickness of about 514 thousandths. So that's 14 thousandths that allow for some sanding. So I've made myself a jig here with some toggle clamps. And I use this for laminating these little pieces for the tops. I'm going to put some glue on this piece and we're going to glue them together. And I put some tape around the outside of this so that any squeeze out won't glue my assembly to the jig. Push that snugly into the corner. Let's put a spacer piece on the top so we get more uniform pressure. And we'll let that set for 1/2 hour and it'll be done. Okay, now I need to plane all of these pieces to exactly a 1/2 inch. I don't have any extra wood to waste, so I don't want any planer snipe. So I use a leading stick and a trailing stick to keep the rollers in place as I plane these so I don't wind up with snipe on the ends of the boards. So my laminated top should be all done now. We'll take it out of the jig. And we now have walnut on the inside and figured maple for the top. So I've added the sacrificial fence to my saw. I've added a stop at exactly 4 inches. And then I will cut each piece and number them as I go so that they fit back together in exactly the order that they were cut, so that the grain will line up on each piece. Day 2 in the old bald guy's shop. And we have all of our pieces cut for 4 boxes. Last night I laminated up some more pieces for end pieces. So this one has sapele on the inside and paddock on the outside. This one has paddock on the inside and curly maple on the outside. The lace wood will not have a laminated top. It'll all be the same. And then the walnut one will have the walnut on the inside and the figured maple on the outside. I have my router table set up, and this is the lock miter bit that we're going to use to cut those lock miter joints. I have a couple of pieces from a previous project that are the lock miter joint pieces, and they fit together like that. I will use those to help me set the proper depth and the proper distance from the fence so that we get this cut correctly. So that piece slides in. Now we need to set the fence, so we'll turn this perpendicular and we'll put the piece that's going to go in vertically in there. And we'll push the fence, push it up against the fence until the fence is where we want it to be. And we'll test that. Before we cut this joint, we're going to take a couple of test pieces and run them through just to see if we've got it right, because I don't want to make a mistake on the pieces that I'm using on the box. Okay, we've cut all of the lock miter corners on these pieces so that they fit together and form a box. But this box is 4 inches high and it's 4 inches square, and aesthetically it looks better if the box is shorter than it is wide and square. So now I'm going to cut off 3/4 of an inch of this, and at the same time I'm going to put an inside bevel of 45 degrees. So I have my table saw set to 45 degrees, and I set the fence at 2 3/4 because that will be the inside point where the saw hits this 1/2 inch thick piece of wood. So now we've cut the sides to the proper dimension. We have a 45, top and bottom. We have our lock miter joint on the end. Now I'm going to cut all the rest of the sides and then we'll come back. Now we have our pieces all cut to proper height and beveled on the top and the bottom. And we're going to put them all together, squeeze them up tight so that we can get an accurate measurement for the top. There's a saying among woodworkers that you can never have too many clamps. Well, this is certainly an illustration of that concept. Okay, now I'm ready to cut the top. So I cut this top so that this cut came just to the edge of the wood. Actually, that's a pretty good fit. Yeah, I think by the time I clamp that, it'll be fine. So I'm going to go ahead and cut the top on the same saw settings. So the next part of this process is the glue up, and it's a little tricky because we have 4 corners to glue and a top and bottom before the glue starts to set. So I always use, for this kind of a process, the Titebond 3, the green cap Titebond, because it has a slower tack time, doesn't set up as quick, and allows me to get everything clamped into place before the glue starts to set. Mark these with an X, so I got to keep my orientation as I put the top on. it's all straightened up. So we've taken the clamps off, our glue is dry, our box is all completely sealed up, no lid. But we'll see later how we make a lid. Okay, so now we're going to do our sanding, and out of the sanding bench, we're just going to use an orbital sander with 150 grit. Okay, for the next step, we are going to cut a slot on the top and bottom of this box that will accommodate a trim piece. And to do that, we're going to modify the router table just a little bit with a little sacrificial fence here that gives me very, very small clearance. This has a little riser piece that I'm going to run my box against, so that only the very bottom part of the box is running against it, so that if there is the slightest inaccuracy in square of the box, it won't prevent me from getting a true straight cut at the bottom. So this little fence, its purpose is to allow for that. So we're going to set up to do the trim. So I have these little trim pieces that I cut using the planer. So they're essentially a quarter by a quarter, but if I measure them, they're actually about 236 thousandths of an inch. So I want to cut a slot in this box all the way around the top that will be just about 5 thousandths less than the width of this box, or this trim, pardon me. Both on the bottom and on the top, so that we're going to have trim pieces around here. You'll see why later. So to do that, we need to set our router to the proper depth and the proper fence dimension. So I said this was 230, about 240 thousandths. Okay, we're at 234 thousandths there, so that's a good height. Leaves us about 5 thousandths up there that we can sand off. So to set the fence depth, I'm going to use my micrometer again, but first I have to get the bit turned absolutely parallel or perpendicular to the widest point here, right there. So that's the deepest point that's going to cut. Now I'm going to adjust my fence, so I'll pull that in a bit. And we'll work this back to about 235 thousandths. Okay, 235 thousandths, we'll tighten the fence down. And I'm going to use a piece of scrap to test this first. I can catch my fingernail on the edge of that piece, just enough to tell that there's a little bit left here to sand off, and that's all I need. So I've got my setup absolutely perfect. Now I'm going to cut the box. So all of the boxes are glued up, and we have done the initial cuts for the trim pieces. And the trim pieces kind of go on like this. They'll get cut at 45s and glued into place, but there is also an inlay that's going to go into the top. And these get trimmed bottom and top. So that will be the next step after we have cut the slots for the inlays. So this lacewood box is going to get the ebony trim, but I don't have enough of that cut, so I'm going to have to make some more pieces of that. So I'll show you how I do that. So now we've got to set the router to cut a slot to accommodate an inlay piece. These little inlays are available commercially. I buy them off the internet or down at Woodcraft. And this one is about 241 thousandths wide. So I already have my router set here to cut the slots for the trim pieces on the boxes. Now I need to move my fence back 240 thousandths roughly. I'll leave a couple thousandths less so that this will be a snug fit. So to do this, all we want to know is that we have moved the fence back 240 thousandths. That's the important part. So I'm just going to turn my bit so that I'm kind of on a flat spot on the bit. Doesn't have to be on the edge of the bit. I'll set my caliper up here, turn it on, and zero it with it set against that bit. Now I can loosen this up and simply tap this back until I get a reading of 240 thousandths on my caliper, and we'll run a test piece through and we should have a perfect fit. So we'll zero this again. So the first order of business now is to put the trim on the bottom side of the box, and after we have completed that and glued it and sanded it flat, then we'll turn it over and we'll do the top and the inlay. These are cut at a 45 miter on the corners, so we're going to set our saw again at 45 and we'll use the miter gauge with a fence on it and cut all these to fit. So we have test fit these trim pieces. I had to make some minor adjustments to get them exactly the right length. They're clamped in place. Now we're going to glue them in place, and after that glue dries, we'll sand off the bottom so that it's flush, and then we'll flip this over and we'll work on the top. We'll cut the trim, and then we'll cut the inlay pieces. So now we're going to glue up and we'll come back. Okay, so we're going to cut our inlay now, and I've laid this piece in here. It's already got a 45 cut on this end. I have marked with a sharp pencil from the corner of this little inlay channel to the corner of our trim pieces that we just have clamped in place. They're not glued yet. And now I'm going to cut that line with a sharp chisel on my cutting board. So I'll just move my cutting board over here. I've drawn a line on my cutting board that is parallel with the edge of the cutting board. I'll lay my trim piece on there and get it lined up with that line. Put my 45-degree gauge on here. Making sure I keep this all perfectly lined up with the line. There's our cut. Now we'll see if we got this piece cut correctly. And it fits right into there, matching in the corners. And now we're going to do the same for the remaining three pieces until they all fit perfectly. Okay, so we've cut our corners on the inlay and matched the corners as well as we could. They're all sitting snugly in place, and the next step is to glue them in place along with the trim pieces on the edge. So that all gets done at the same time. So we have 4 clamps holding this in place right now. We're going to take 2 of them off. Lay them aside so that they're all lined up ready to put right back on. By keeping these end pieces in place, we're keeping the alignment correct so nothing can move. It has to go back exactly the way it came out. Get my glue brush out. And I will just lift these pieces off and set them in the orientation that they go back on both sides. Put a little glue in the slot. I kind of have to work quickly here, even though this Tight Bond 3 is a little slower to dry. We still don't want to let this glue joint get dry before we get the other sides in place as well. Okay, we'll replace these two clamps. Now I have to get these two clamps off and get the other side done before glue starts to set up. Now I have a piece of epay here that I've cut to the right length, and I use this to make sure that those pieces are all seated well to the bottom. And I'm going to go over the trim pieces as well. Got everything seated in place. Sorry about that compressor noise. I forgot I had it turned on. And now, before that glue has a chance to dry, I'm going to get 4 more clamps on here to secure the corners real good and keep anything from moving out of place, and to make sure that it is down tight. We don't want a gap under that trim. All right, everything is secured. Now we just wait for glue to dry. Okay, so we glued and sanded the top. We sanded all the sides, so everything is down flush. All of this trim is down flush with the wood. top, bottom, sides, everywhere. Now we're going to cut the top off. In case you were wondering how we got into this box, we're going to cut 1 inch off the top of this with the bandsaw, and then there'll be more work to do to fit that top back where it goes. Okay, we've cut the top out. I'll dust this out good, and then I'm going to make a mark with a magic marker in here on the inside, corresponding so that after we work on this some more, the grain matches perfectly when we put the lid back on. So the next step is to clean up these cuts, and we're going to do that with the sandpaper on a flat board over there. So I have a couple of strips of 150 grit sandpaper stuck down to this piece of plywood. And this is my sanding board when I want to make things perfectly flat. And we're going to do that with this. Let me dust this out a bit. And I got to remember to put my alignment mark on the inside. So that I can get this back together in the right orientation after we do the next couple of steps. So we have saw marks to remove from the bandsaw so that this will make a nice smooth fit when we put this back together. And we do that just by hand on here, making sure we keep it flat. But if you just ran, it takes about 120 strokes on here to get all those saw marks out. And if we just did that continuously, we would wind up with one corner of this thing shorter than the other because you can't maintain equal pressure all across this piece as you're sanding. So about every 10 strokes, I turn it 90 degrees until we've got all those saw marks out. Okay, we've finished sanding. We got all the saw marks out of the top and bottom. And those fit together perfectly. No seam showing anywhere. And now the last step is to put a riser in the top so that that riser will then sit down into the bottom part of the box to hold that top exactly in place. You could put hinges on this if you wanted to, but I always find it's problematic getting the hinges to line up perfectly. So by just using a riser in the top, this top will sit on there and you won't even be able to tell where the seam is on the box when we're done. So we're going to make the riser out of a piece of this same wood, the lace wood, that has been ripped to 3/4 of an inch, planed to 1/8 of an inch, so it's a real thin piece. And then, I don't know if you can see this in the video, the top edge of this has been rounded with a 1/16 inch roundover bit, so we have a nice smooth edge on the part of it that will be visible or where your hand would touch it. So we're going to make mitered pieces to fit into the top, and then those will be glued in to finish the piece. So I've cut all my riser pieces, and now we're just going to use a little bit of glue in here to put them in place. They're going to fit pretty snugly. We mitered these the same way as we did the trim pieces over there. It's nothing different, it's just a shorter piece. And we'll put some little C-clamps on these just to keep them pressed securely against the side all the way around. We don't need much pressure. We don't want to mark the outside of the box with the head of the clamp. Okay, we got them all clamped up. We'll let the glue dry on that a bit, then we'll come back and take the clamps off and make the final adjustments to this with sandpaper so that it fits perfectly into the box and everything's going to be true and square when we're done. Okay, now that we have the risers glued into the top of the box, you can see that. We have to adjust those just a little bit with some sandpaper. I have a sanding block that I've made out of a piece of Brazilian redwood, so it's real smooth on the edge. I've wrapped adhesive back sandpaper on there and trimmed it with a razor knife at the edge so that when I sand this, I can stand that up flush on the side and just take a couple of strokes against each side here to smooth that out, and it doesn't mark my surface. I have my alignment marks on here so that I can get the top back on in the proper direction. And that top is just a little snug. I could force it in there, but I don't want to do that. So I'll sand the corners a little bit more. I'm going to sand just a little on the inside. Did it. So now we can see, if I can get this close enough to the camera here, you can barely tell where the seam is on that, and after a little bit of judicial sanding here, you probably won't be able to tell at all. So all of that sanding is done, and the only thing left now is to ease the edges a little bit, because by sanding these on a flat surface, it's left these fairly sharp on the edges, and so we'll just use a foam sanding block 220 grit to hit all of the edges and just take some of that sharpness off of them. There we have a finished lacewood box with ebony trim and an inlay in the top. This is just a look at the lock miter joint in the corners of this box, so you understand how that joint fits together. So we have all the box parts done, except for one final step, and that is to put a roundover on the trim piece on the top. And we're going to do that with a 3/16 roundover bit, since we have a 1/4 inch square trim. And because some of this wood tends to chip out pretty bad, if you run the piece into the bit, I'm going to go with the bit. That's not my preferred method of running a router, but when I have a fine piece like this that's all done and I can't afford any chip out, going with the direction of the blade of the bit is the way to keep this from chipping out. So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to round them all over. So all of our boxes are basically complete now. The only thing that's left is to lacquer them. They've been fine sanded. They're all ready. The lids just lift off. So we're ready to put lacquer on, and I just cover my workbench with some plastic, and I have an old spice rack underneath for a turntable, my painting board that has 40 layers of paint on it. And I just set these on top of some pieces of wood that have some screws in it. So it's sitting on the screw heads, keeps it up off the board, keeps debris off of it. Respirator, I always wear the respirator with the lacquer, a lot of volatile organic compounds there, and I have a blower up in the corner of the shop, and I'll open a window to let it vent. Okay, our project is finished. 4 boxes, took about a week in the shop, probably averaged 6 hours per box. 2 coats of lacquer with a little bit of light steel wooling between at the end. All of the tops are rounded over. We have a precision fit on the lids. Can't even see the seam in most places. And the last is the lace wood. Give you a close-up of what that lace wood looks like. The lacquer really brings out the grain and the color in it. Like I said, about 6 hours per box to build these, but they make a wonderful gift for friends or family who are mourning a loved one, and perhaps you could find other uses for them. So if you decide to make them, enjoy.